Hello, my name's Tim Vickery, and welcome to what we hope is going to be the first of monthly little chats. And because it's the first, where better to start than Uruguay, the first champions of the world? Now, Uruguay, there can be an air of melancholy in the place. It's part of its charm, I suppose. But 20 years ago, that melancholy was especially strong, and there was no charm in the air. And that's because they'd failed to qualify for another World Cup. They hadn't made it to Germany 2006. And that meant that in a run of four World Cups, they'd missed out on three and been knocked out of the group stage in the other. Now, this hurt. This hurt really, really badly. Uruguay, a country of so many late 19th, early 20th century immigrants pouring in from Italy and Spain. The identity of Uruguay really is built around football, being that those two Olympic gold medals in the 1920s and winning the first two World Cups that they entered in 30 and 50. As the phrase goes, other countries have their history. Uruguay has its football. And 20 years ago, they were thinking, it's all over. We will never again be contenders. As it's turned out, that pessimism has proved unjustified. Uruguay have come back. They were semi finalists in the World Cup 2010, quarter finalists in 2018. And if they're not right there at football's top table, they're not far off it. How have they done it? How have they performed this comeback? And I think the answer has everything to do with the under 20 level. Now, it was 20 years ago, after they failed to qualify for Germany 2006, that Oscar Washington Tabárez returned for his second spell as national team coach. He'd taken them to Italia 90. Very interesting, clever man. He was a player, a coach, and also a teacher, always referred to as El Maestro, Tabárez. And when he took over for this second spell 20 years ago, he'd been thinking long and hard about the effects of globalization on the Uruguayan game. Now, you've got to remember that at club level, Uruguay were big players as well. They were regularly winning the Copa Libertadores, South America's Champions League, right up until 1988. After that, after 88, only once has a Uruguayan side got to the final. And the changes are the changes in football business. In the old days, when the main stream of revenue was the stadium, well, 60,000 in the Centenario Stadium in Montevideo is kind of equal to 60,000 in a Bernabeu in Madrid. When the TV age comes in, all of that goes out the window. The market becomes global. And Uruguay, with a population of just over 3 million, simply can't compete anymore. So Tabárez is thinking about the national team really leads him to the view that, you know what, our domestic game is not particularly relevant. Because in this global market of players, if we've got talent, we're going to be losing it early. So his plan was all focused around the Uruguayan youth sides, and especially the under 20s. That was seen as the conveyor belt to the senior side. And what they started doing was using the Uruguayan FA, using the federation to trawl the country in search of players. What kind of players? Well, Tabárez had clearly concluded that in the modern game, speed was all important. So he was looking for players with speed of movement, speed of thought, speed of technical execution. And the idea then was that the Uruguayan FA would use their facilities to develop these players, but also as human beings, educational programs, and specifically build up an identification with these youngsters and that sky blue shirt of the Uruguayan national team. So they might be sold abroad when they're 19, but they would have a bond. They would be well aware of what they were representing when they put on the Uruguay shirt. And this program was extraordinarily successful. And it helped that there was a useful generation coming up. In 2005, the under 20 side didn't perform very well. This is before the Tabárez project. Didn't perform well, that side. but it did include the goalkeeper, Muslera, and the centre-back, Diego Godin. That's two players who went on to be stalwarts for the national team at senior level. The 2007 under-20s, the first under the Tabárez reign. Well, who'd you get in that? You get a defender, Martin Cáceres, and you get the big two. You get Edison Cavani and Luis Suarez, the strike partnership. So straight away, just in two blocks of the under-20 side, you've got five players there who are some of the greatest that Uruguay has ever produced. That's five players with more than 100 caps for the national team. And the under-20s have consistently been excellent since, and they've consistently been producing players for the senior side. Jimenez, the centre-back, part of the team that got through to the final of the under-20 World Cup a few years ago. After that, you got Valverde, Bentancur, Darwin Nunez, all of them coming up the ranks of the under-20 side. Now, I'm talking as the current version of the under-20 World Cup goes into its last week. Uruguay aren't there. They didn't qualify. But 2 years ago, they were world champions. So for the next few days, Uruguay are the reigning world champions at under-20 level. But here, our story hits a but. Because of that under-20 side, champions of the world, the expectation was that Marcelo Bielsa, Uruguay's senior coach, would fast track a number of them into the senior side. Because that's the way it's been in the past. And Bielsa had a look at this, tried this. But the conclusion is, 2 years after that triumph, that these players just haven't kicked on. Looking at the lineup, the star players of that lineup, the captain, the technical midfielder, Fabricio Diaz, he's gone to Saudi Arabia. The attacking right back, very interesting player, Mateo Ponte, came to Brazil. He's a reserve at Botafogo. Centre-back looks very classy, Sebastian Boselli. But he's gone to Argentina, where he's ping-ponged between River Plate and Estudiantes, but he's spending most of his time on the bench. And the one seen as the star player of that team, the striker, Luciano Rodriguez, well, he was picked up by the City Group, and he was at Bahia in Brazil, but didn't really live up to expectations, and he's now gone to the Arab world as well. Now, of these players, Rodriguez is the only one who appeared in the 18 rounds of World Cup qualification. He came once off the bench. And if he hasn't kicked on as expected, I think in his case, there's been a problem of definition. What is he? Bielsa didn't see him as a centre forward. He saw him more as a wide striker. When he was at Bahia, they saw him more as a centre forward. So what do you want to do? Do you want to build him up physically, or do you want to get him quicker? So I think there's been a problem of definition there. But the big point I'm making here is that of those players from the 23 under-20 World Cup win, none of them have kicked on. There's still plenty of time. You know, they're still young players. But this does tally with something that my business-minded friends are telling me, which is that in the case of the Uruguayan players, the return on investment is falling. So you're not getting the same bang that you got from previous generations, even though they're world champions at under 20 level. Now, how can we explain this dynamic? And I think there are a number of things that we can put into the mix here. One is simply cyclical. Perhaps the latest generation are not quite as good as the one who've come before. Now, if you look at the history of South American football, that's so common everywhere apart from Brazil and Argentina. You get a generation coming through. On Peru, for example, with the generation of Cubillas in the 70s. They were South American champions in 75. They've never really replaced that generation. Colombia had and Colombia has the biggest population in South America with the exception of Brazil. Colombia had the Valderrama generation in the late 80s and early 90s, and it took them a fair while to replace that. Not until the James Rodriguez generation came through for the 2014 World Cup, were they major players. Chile, the outstanding example of the moment. 10 years ago, it was the best period ever in the history of the Chilean national team. With that golden generation spearheaded by Alexis Sanchez, Arturo Vidal, well, they are really, really in the doldrums now. They finished bottom of the table in South America's last World Cup qualifiers, and they are hosting the Under 20 World Cup. But they went out very early after losing 3 of their 4 games and winning the other one with the last kick of the match. And so there is a cyclical thing to the sudden appearance of talent, and obviously Uruguay's population is just over 3 million. There is a limit to the amount of quality players that they can produce. So this is perhaps one explanation for this declining return on investment in Uruguayan players, that this generation isn't quite as good as some of the preceding ones. Another explanation, I think, is that of increased competition in youth development. The Uruguay thing with Tabárez, there was a precedent there. Jose Peckerman was doing this with Argentina at the end of the last century and the start of this one. And Tabárez had a look at that, used that as his model, and expanded that model. But now so many countries are paying more attention to youth development. You can see that clearly from the finalists of the Euros last year. And England were coached by Gareth Southgate, a man of the system. And the England national team now, with their training facilities, have been placing much more emphasis on producing at youth level. A while ago, England were world champions at under 17 and under 20 level. And Southgate, as a man of that system, the criteria for selection for his senior national team was different from anything before. Performances in the Premier League no longer the sole thing to be taken into consideration with selection. How well have you done at under 20 level? Now that's at the youth levels. Now that's important for all of the South American sides. All of the South Americans now, with the money that they get from the Marathon World Cup qualification format, you've got plenty of guaranteed home games, guaranteed income. A lot of them have been using that money with the under 20s, because if in today's globalized world, if you're a country like Uruguay, Paraguay, and so on, your players are going to be scattered all over the world. They're going to be scattered all over Europe, the Middle East, and the Americas. So one criteria there for deciding who gets in front of who is who's done best wearing the national team shirt at youth levels. And Spain as well. I mean, Spain, when they appointed De La Fuente as the coach, there was general befuddlement and bewilderment. Who is this? Again, a man from the system. And Spain been producing players through their youth system. So the competition now at under 20 level and youth level in general, I think is much stiffer. And look at Morocco. Morocco in the semi-finals of the current under 20 World Cup, where just like the World Cup, they will meet France in the semi-finals. And that's very evocative, because a lot of this rise of Morocco has to do with youth development in France and Holland and so on, because they're getting players from the diaspora. So it's perhaps harder for the youth products of Uruguay to stand out, because the attention that Uruguay have been giving to under 20 football, now a lot of countries are investing in youth development at the national level. But still, 2 years ago, Uruguay were world champions in the under 20 World Cup. They beat Italy in the final, which leads me to my last point on this, which is that just perhaps the under 20 World Cup is no longer fit for purpose. The game has changed in important senses. And one is that the pitches now, certainly in Western Europe, are so much better. Where the pitches used to be mud heaps from November through to March, now you've got carpets. So different pitches mean you're producing a different type of player. Rather than players who can run through the mud, you're now aiming to produce more technical players whose skill can shine on that carpet. Also, there is much more protection for talent than there was certainly up until 30, 35 years ago. And if you look at some of the games from pre 1990, and some of those tackles that didn't even get a yellow card in those days would probably get a jail sentence this time. So the pitches are better, talent is more protected, and a consequence of this is that younger players can be thrown in, where before they would just be kicked right out of the game. So the best 18, 19-year-olds are already important players with their club sides. Now, as the Under 20 World Cup, there is no obligation for clubs to release players. And clubs are clearly not going to release players who are important to their club's side. On Brazil, for example, Estevão leads a long, long list of players who could be with the Brazil side. It was practically a Brazil B or maybe even C side that went out in the group phase. Even Argentina, who were in the semi-finals, and their star player in qualification was El Diablito Echeverri, who picked up by City and he's now in Germany this year. They also had Mastro Antonio, who is now, of course, at Real Madrid, and he hasn't been released either. So the conclusion that you end up with is that the Under 20 World Cup is now pretty random. It's a case of who can you get to play in the tournament? Who's going to be released to play in the tournament? So clearly, this doesn't take anything away from the importance of work at under 20 level, but it does mean that there's a random quality to the under 20 World Cup. It's still excellent for developing players, but you do have to ask the question, which players? Because the very best now, they're not going to get released. Which means that just because you've won the World Cup at under 20 level, that doesn't necessarily mean you've got a whole group of players who are going to go on and be senior stars. So I think it's all of these factors together that help explain this declining return on investment for Uruguayan players over the last few years. So the junior winners of the Under 20 World Cup in 2023 are not necessarily going to become senior champions. That doesn't mean that there are grounds for extra melancholy in Montevideo, because I think one thing that we can guarantee is with the strength of the football culture that they have and the dark times behind them, Uruguay will continue to punch above their weight. Thank you very much. See you next time.